danced on the Sabbath and I cured the lame. The holy people said it was a shame. They whipped and they stripped and they hung me high, and they left me there on a cross to die. Dance then wherever you may be. I am the Lord of the dance, said he, and I lead you all wherever you may be, and I lead you all in the dance, said he. I danced on the Friday when the sky turned black. It's hard to dance with the devil on your back. They buried my body and they thought I'd gone, but I am the dance and I'll still go on. Dance then wherever you may be. I am the Lord of the dance, said he, and I'll lead you all wherever you may be, and I'll lead you all in the dance, said he. They cut me down and I leapt up high. I am the life that'll never, never die. I live in you if you live in me. I am the Lord of the dance, said he. Dance then wherever you may be. I am the Lord of the dance, said he, and I'll lead you all wherever you may be, and I'll lead you all in the dance, said he.
Dear friends, welcome to RUC's online services. As we're moving closer to the final quarter of the year, our treasurer has told us that we will be running a deficit at the end of the year. We're committed to continue to offer these online presentations and interviews to you, but the yearly costs involved to produce them with our professional editors and technicians are almost 100,000 Rand. I know that many of you are already supporting RUC generously, but there might be some of you who would like to make a special contribution or come on board with a monthly or yearly donation. If 100 viewers would chip in Rand 100 a month, our yearly costs would be fully covered. Please send us an email to info@rondeboschunited.org if you would like to support us, and we will send you our church's banking details. Thank you very much. And so, grace and peace to you, in the name of the one who was and is to come. Amen. The brief narrative on the prophet Elijah in the book of Kings has captivated Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scholars. The drama, intensity, and sense of mystery of the biblical account also inspired artists in every age, ranging from frescoes, stained glass, paintings, icons, altarpieces, to spectacular illuminated manuscripts. Elijah's glorious departure to heaven, riding on a chariot of fire, was interpreted to mean that, not having died a natural death, he could return at any moment in time. Incidentally, there is a beautifully carved chair in our sanctuary which is called Elijah's chair. In Judaism, Elijah is believed to announce the beginning of the Messianic era. His return is said to signal the beginning of God's new creation. At each Passover meal, a place is kept empty at the table for Elijah. The broker between the worlds, the present and the future, could return at any moment. And though Elijah's triumph over the prophets of Baal is mentioned only briefly in the Quran, the rich imagination of Islamic folklore also brought his character alive. In Sufism, the prophet is highly esteemed as a spiritual guide, able to initiate the believer into divine mysteries. Elijah is the only character in the Hebrew Scriptures who was made a saint in both Western and Eastern churches and was considered the father of monasticism. The biblical account presents us with a prophet who is keenly aware of God's presence. We just need to think of the prophet's experience of standing outside the cave of Mount Horeb and encountering God not in the earthquake or fire, but in the quiet, gentle sound. We are told very little about Elijah's origins. He appears out of nowhere and makes himself heard and known during the time of Israel's kings in the 19th century BCE. His prophetic ministry begins with a dramatic confrontation, holding King Ahab accountable for the sudden drought in Israel. Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." King Ahab is warned of an unexpected drought that will bring death and despair to his kingdom. When the prophet Elijah approaches him, it becomes clear that the lack of dew and rain will be the immediate result of royal failure and mismanagement. But the root cause of such corruption and incompetence is seen to be Ahab's diplomatic plotting and scheming. King Ahab married Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon, who introduced Israel to the fertility cult of Baal and Asherah in opposition to the official worship of Yahweh. Jezebel comes across as radical and violent in her approach to convert Israel to her religion. Altars dedicated to the God of the Exodus were destroyed, and Israel's prophets suffered persecution and death. The values and practices of the Baal cult were contrary to Israel's faith and, according to the prophets, undermined society's cohesion and moral standards. This is most poignantly illustrated with the novella on Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21. Jezebel robs Naboth of his vineyard with a perfidious plan. She hires ruthless men to accuse Naboth of blasphemy, who then is stoned, leaving behind his wife and children. It is a case of judicial murder and reveals the level of corruption, greed, and moral decay among the political elite. Elijah's name means Yahweh is Lord, and in that sense becomes programmatic of his calling. He dares to confront the king and warns him that the lack of royal devotion and faithfulness to the God of the Exodus will bring about divine judgment. Many of us will no longer share the ancient worldview of considering a drought the direct result of divine intervention and punishment. But we would agree today that the present ecological crisis is also a moral failure. Political and economic interests seem to always trump the need to care for God's creation. What our ancestors in the faith classified as divine punishment, today's scientists would criticize as the devastating consequences of our own doing. What both would agree on, though, is that we need to heed the words of the prophets of doom and assume responsibility for our actions. For only accountability will lead to a change of heart and bring healing to the earth and all its people. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann would like us to think of drought as an ancient form of energy crisis for which government is responsible. We know about the chaos and despair such an energy crisis provokes. We also know how such a crisis affects both the rich and the poor, but the poor are always those who feel it first, and for them it becomes a matter of life and death. King Ahab and his corrupt government have been discredited. Power now lies no longer with the political elite, but with Elijah's prophetic word. Everything depends on the ruling party's willingness to humble themselves and listen to Elijah. Only obedience to his word will end the drought. The biting irony in the story is that Baal was worshipped as the god of dew and rain, but Elijah announces that the worship of Baal has the very opposite effect, resulting in drought and hunger. From the echelons of power and the failed royal system, the story moves quickly to the individuals and the suffering inflicted by political indifference. Our attention is first of all directed to Elijah himself. We encounter a prophet who does not speak from the safety and comfort of the royal court, but rather suffers with his people. All he can depend on is the word of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Cherith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I've directed the ravens to supply you with food there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Cherith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. In the Hebrew scripture, ravens are associated with places of desolation, desert-like locations usually avoided by human beings. The raven's hollow cooing is experienced as a sorrowful lament of sick and lonely people. But ravens offer Elijah company and make his own sorrow and lament audible. The ravens also minister to him. I wonder if they help themselves from the leftovers of the royal banquets to supply Elijah with meat and bread. Ravens are scavengers and not considered kosher. To Elijah, though, they become kindred spirits, sharing his loneliness and plight, and mirroring his sense of rejection and isolation. He welcomes their presence. In a mysterious exchange, they become feathered angelic beings, reminding him of God's ongoing care. This scene inspired the contemporary Welsh artist Clive Hicks Jenkins. He first encountered the story on a Renaissance altarpiece, and in his own words, as an unbeliever, was smitten with the beauty of the story. He was fascinated by the idea of raven being divine messengers, offering support and sustenance. In his second painting of the same scene, we encounter a prophet in modern-day casual dress, breaking bread and drinking tea. Notice the flaming red angelic raven settling down in the front of the prophet to offer companionship. The artist's representation of animals moves beyond the idea of them acting against their nature because of God's will. They rather appear as free agents who seek connection and show empathy. The mystery becomes even greater. The raven's wings are truly on fire as the bread and cup intimate a moment of holy communion. But after a while, even the small brook begins to dry up and forces Elijah to move on. Again, he depends on the word of the Lord coming to him. Surprisingly, he is led to Sidon in present-day Lebanon, the very place from which his opponent Jezebel comes. He seeks political refuge in the homeland of his oppressor. But it is there that he will meet a widow and her child, who become his source of life and renewed hope. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Sarepta in the region of Sidon and stay there. I've directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Sarepta. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The widow of Sarepta is busy looking for a few sticks to make a fire for her son and herself. She remains unnamed and becomes the face of all those suffering the harsh consequences of political injustice and mismanagement. She has no pension, no rich relatives, no name, but a hungry child. Her small reserves of wheat and oil are quickly drying up. In her quiet suffering, she has no time to concern herself with politics. What difference can she make? All her attention is dedicated to the daily survival. She has succumbed to her fate. Once the last meal has been prepared, she and her son will simply die of hunger. In Elijah, a political refugee on the run from the royal henchman is now also reduced to someone who just hangs on to life and fully depends on God's guidance and the generosity of others. What a strange encounter between a prophet on the run and a despairing widow. We should note that Elijah now becomes a stranger in the very land that worships Baal. The narrative started in the king's palace, a place of power and faithlessness, and ends outside the gates of Sarepta, a place of powerlessness and faith. What the prophet and widow have in common is not only the harsh pain of hunger and sense of powerlessness, but also the slow surfacing of renewed trust in divine comfort and support. Both are about to discover that the God of the Exodus is on the side of the oppressed and discriminated. Elijah fought against Jezebel's conversion program, but with the widow of Sarepta, most likely also a worshipper of Baal, he discovers an ally. The God of the Exodus works in mysterious ways to align people around a common cause, especially when bare survival is at stake. But what should surprise us is the widow's initial resistance to Elijah's request. It has been noted that the Hebrew word for widow resembles the word meaning to be mute, signaling the social isolation and marginalization that comes with widowhood. But the widow of Sarepta does not remain mute and submissive. Elijah does not plead with her, but simply instructs her. But she asserts herself. She is willing to fetch him some water, but makes it clear that the little bread and oil left in the house is just enough to feed her son and herself for the very last time. Despite Elijah's patriarchal expectation to be fed, she prioritizes and protects the needs of her own small family. And she does so by calling on Elijah's God to be a witness to her plight and integrity. Surely his God would not expect her to give the little she has. She affirms the little power and dignity that is left to her in the name of Elijah's God. But Elijah does not give up. This time, though, he acknowledges the widow's plight and makes an astounding promise. Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Don't be afraid, Elijah says. He recognizes that this is a matter of life and death for both of them. But why would Elijah ask to be served first? If we think of the prophet as God's intermediary, then Elijah's request might allude to the ritual of offering Yahweh the first fruits of the harvest as a way of acknowledging God as the giver of all good gifts. The request then becomes an invitation to the widow to put her trust not in Baal, the so-called master. She who is without a husband, traditionally thought of as the master of the household, is encouraged to rather rely on Yahweh, Israel's God of the Exodus, known also as the protector of widows and orphans. The widow from Sidon becomes the narrative counterpart to Queen Jezebel. While Jezebel enjoys royal abundance and persecutes Elijah, the poor widow of Sarepta becomes the prophet's rescuer. It is she, just like the ravens in the previous episode, who reveals the visible and caring presence of Yahweh, the God who hears the plead of the despairing. Scholars will tell us that the story was most likely composed only after Israel's return from exile, when facing the major threat of starvation. We read about it in the book of Nehemiah, when Israel was under Persian rule. Nehemiah strongly believed that the only way to avoid a major catastrophe was for Israel's men to dismiss their foreign wives. The book of Ruth, also written during those times, presents us with a strong protest against such nationalistic and discriminatory practices. The two widows, Ruth and Naomi, show how life-giving alliances and loyalties can be formed across ethnic and religious divides. Their solidarity marks a strong protest against the mindset of us and them. Elijah's encounter with the widow of Sarepta breathes a similar spirit and presents us with the same kind of protest. The problem are not foreign women, but Israel's inability to hear and trust the word of God. How long will Elijah be able to hold on to such insight? Sharing food and water crosses over human-made divides. The margin becomes the new center. A foreign widow from Sidon moves into the center of Israel's history and becomes an instrument of God's grace and abundance. And Elijah is not the male hero of the story, but a partner in an alliance driven by the sheer struggle to survive. Elijah and the widow need each other and find each other. Elijah then shares with her the promise of God made to him and affirms her role in being not just a passive recipient of charity, but an active agent of divine change. Working together and trusting each other will allow justice to flow like a river, constantly refilling the jar of flour and the jug of oil until the day that new rains will put an end to the drought. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. What kind of world is this, where refugees find safety and food in the land of their opponents? What kind of land is this where strangers meet and in working together discover God's abundance in their lives? There's a magical realism at play. Ravens deeply care for a stranded prophet. Jars of flour and jugs of oil do not stop giving and feed a widow and her child. How much of it is historical truth and how much artistic freedom and religious imagination? But even if we cannot establish the historicity of these accounts or have become suspicious of the miraculous, we do sense that the authors were trying to be truthful to their experiences of God's comfort and care in even the most unlikely places and circumstances. Elijah's legendary stories come to us from a faraway place, both so different and similar to ours. These stories have been told again and again to comfort, to fight hopelessness, to help endure tough times, and to encourage new alliances across former divides. What happened once upon a time is believed to have relevance for every new generation. Such abundance in the midst of a drought, such generosity in the midst of great scarcity, such companionship in the midst of religious rivalry. And all of this because God brings two people together that would have otherwise never met. But difficult times call for unexpected coalitions, synergies driven by both despair and the trust in the God who is on the side of the rejected and forgotten. How do fairy tales usually end? And if they did not die, they lived happily ever after. Do the authors of our biblical story not also believe that those characters in the story never die? We find them in every new generation, and their example inspires us to believe that even today jars of flour and jugs of oil can be refilled. They remind us that there is a divine abundance which is able to flow when what we have is shared. There is enough to go around to feed everyone. But for such abundance to flow, new, strong loyalties need to be forged. On the mountain of Transfiguration, Jesus was seen in the company of Moses and Elijah. What did they talk about? Did they comfort and encourage Jesus with their stories and experiences? I'm not surprised that the gospel writers cast Jesus as the new Moses and the new Elijah. Jesus was not afraid to challenge those in power and cared for the well-being of widows and those considered least in society. And did Jesus not also gratefully receive 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread from a child, ending up feeding a hungry crowd of 5,000 with baskets of bread that never stopped giving? Does such bold sharing require a miracle? Or are those stories meant to inspire a deeper trust in God's abundance that is revealed where those threatened by an energy crisis and starvation discover the gift of sharing? Maybe such a change of heart is the greatest miracle of all. As you leave from here and face a world driven by the fear of scarcity, may God bless you with experiences of sharing that renew your trust in God's loving care and abundance. Amen.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do think to myself,